Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us, and for those of you who are joining us live, but also those of you who will be watching this recording later on. Welcome to the second of a three-part series in addressing Australia's lost conversations. My name is Mark Yettica-Paulson. I'm the practice lead for deep collaboration at Collaboration for Impact. And today I'm joined by Liz Skelton, who's a co-founder and director for Collaboration for Impact, and Aleem Ali, who is the CEO of Welcoming Australia, Welcoming Cities here in Brisbane with me, but we're both on screens, as you can see. So we just wanted to begin this session with we brought in the music of Mariah Carey, and if you've been to any shopping centre in the last week or perhaps the last month, you would have heard that song. That album is famous at this time of year. It continues to play in shopping centres around, and I guess it was a way to evocatively bring in what the conversation is about today. The fact that we have all of these conventions and traditions that we do that happen at this time of year, and for some of us it is a moment of not so much joy and peace, but there is a narrative that brings these images. And how do we navigate this time in a way that means we really belong here? So we're going to have that conversation today. But as I said, this is two of a three-part series. The first one we did in November, during NAIDOC in November, where we focused on the theme of NAIDOC, always was, always will be. This one is about the traditions, conventions, and ceremonies that reveal our identity and belonging. And the next conversation is going to be on the 19th of January, where we have a conversation about finding a new national day. So the format for today will be Aleem and I and Liz will have a dialogue, and Liz is going to be leading the, setting the pace for that and putting us through the tough questions, and also convening the dialogue. So I'll hand it over to Liz now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and hi everybody. Welcome to the Deep Collaboration webinar. I'd just like to first start by acknowledging all the different country that we're joining from today, and to welcome you all. I'm joining you from Gadigal land in the Eora Nation in Sydney, and please introduce yourself in the chat by just letting us know where you're from and what land you're joining us on today. That would be great, just so we can see the different country that we're all on today. So delighted to be joined today by Aleem for us to explore this conversation around really what we want to be understanding is, how do our traditions reveal our identity and belong, and how might that be an adaptive challenge that we're in? So in deep collaboration and the work that we do in Collaboration for Impact, our vision is for an equitable and inclusive society. And our focus is on looking at how do we shift the conditions which are keeping complex problems in place. We see one of those conditions as our unreconciled history of colonization in Australia, and our inability to be able to adapt necessarily to a more inclusive and equitable society. So this conversation today, while we're coming up to Christmas, we're looking at this time of year, really we want to unpack and explore what has this got to do with some of those broader leadership challenges. So before we dive in, I just want to say a wee bit about protocol. We'd really love it if any observations you're making, you can use the chat function, or any notes you want to capture that way. But if you have a question that you want to put to any of us and to add into the conversation, to please use the Q&A function so that we can be able to make sure that they come in as we go. So great to see people coming in from Marawina land, from Ghana country, Gadigal country. Welcome to everybody where you are. And we might just kick off then by starting with us. You know, we often say leadership starts here, and it starts with us. And in relation to this conversation about, we're at the end of the year, there's various traditions around that reveal, you know, a bit about who we are. To start with, what does this time of year mean and look like for you? So Aleem, I might just start with you, and just to welcome you. Would you like to introduce and say a wee bit about your organisation as well?
Yes, hello. Thanks, Liz. I'm joining you today from Turrbal Yagara country, otherwise known as Brisbane, just south of the river on the lands of the Jagera people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge their continuing connection with this land that I'm on today. I'm the CEO of Welcoming Australia. We're a small not-for-profit organisation that works in a number of spaces, particularly focused on diversity and inclusion and cultural diversity and inclusion. We do a lot of work with local governments across Australia through that lens, helping them have a more planned approach to migration and settlement, and recognising that this is a country that even pre-colonisation for millennia was home to hundreds of language groups and complex societies. And so diversity and pluralism is very much part of our DNA as a country. And a continent. And so that's sort of the space that we work in. Christmas, I think, to me, is a really interesting time. Traditionally and professionally, it's the time that I pause, that I stop, that I reflect. I'll often take leave if I'm in the privileged position of being able to do that from work. And it's a time of family. I grew up in a household that was a multi-faith household. So my dad's a Muslim, my mum was Methodist Uniting Church. And so we celebrated multiple traditions. We celebrated Ramadan and Eid, and we celebrated Christmas and Easter. And so it's a time generally of celebration, of bringing family together. But it also is, in our household, particularly marks a time of loss and grief. This year, on the 25th of December, will mark 25 years since my mum passed away. And so it's a great time, but I think also a challenging time.
Well, thanks, Aleem. And I think you're drawing out there that, you know, we're often holding that duality between celebration, but also for many of us, there's loss in whatever form that takes. And that, you know, that's very much part of what comes to the fore at this time of year. Mark, would you like to say a bit about what does this time of year mean for you? And how do you celebrate?
Well, this you get to December and you realize that at this time there is the opportunity to I guess engage in the end of year work, you know, the end of year moments, the end of year celebrations. I remember growing up with a great sense of expectation. You know, you get to December and school holidays kicked in. It was very hot, and you just had this extended time of nothingness. Although my parents would always give me things to do around the house. It's just like, how can there be so many things to do around the house? It's really hot, you know. I remember that growing up, that sense of, you know, you get to the December and then, yeah, it's like magic happens for all kinds of reasons. But I also grew up with a bit of I knew that something wasn't quite right. So my parents, as Baptist church workers, they, so we had a lot of the Christian traditions, but I kept asking questions about why the pine tree and why are we doing this and how come the snow and why do all the cards have the snow on it and all this sort of, and I can remember these questions as a child, but also going all the way through high school. And I know I may have said this publicly before, but, you know, it got to the point where my dad was like, so do you want these gifts or not? Do you can you stop asking and deconstructing this tradition that's going on here? So for me, this time of year is about how we have struggled as a country to make sense of what these traditions are that have been brought across from overseas to here. I also carry this memory of perhaps a cultural memory of, so we would have had traditions that came in the hot summer, the high summer, that for us down south, or I say down south, but you know, in the north, there's wet season at this time of year. But anywhere that there's not wet season, it's a dry heat kind of moment, or a tropics, but still it's tropical storm part of the year, but still it's like, how do we had ceremonies that we did at this time of year. So I had this cultural memory of that. And then as an adult, really struggling with, how do I pass on what kind of tradition to my own children? How do I give them a something to say, here, you should wear this hat. Here, we're going to frost some windows. Here, we're going to bake this pudding. I don't know why, but we're going to do it. And for me, I really struggle with that as an adult. And so I think the reason why I wanted to bring this in as a conversation for deep collaboration, because I feel that this asks questions about, what does it mean to be at home here? To be at home and to do ceremonies and to do conventions and social traditions and things like that, that make us feel at home when it is very hot. I remember crunchy grass because the grass all dried out in the drought seasons. So I've got all these memories of the hot, 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 and yet I'm looking at images and looking at this, what is it, the fantasy narrative of these perfect Christmas stories, and it's freezing cold. And to me, I couldn't reconcile that as a child, and still as an adult, I've been wrestling with this ever since. Yeah, that's what this time of year represents for me.
So I may pick up that thread, Mark, because that resonates strongly for me. Sitting here with a Santa hat on in 30-degree heat, so I may take it off in a minute. It really speaks to, I guess, my experience of this time of year. So growing up in Scotland, in the UK, Christmas was a really big time of year with my family. My parents were also multi-faith, my dad being Catholic, my mum being Protestant, and in Scotland at that time that was classed as being from a mixed marriage. And my mum was a minister, she was a priest in the Anglican Church. So this was her busiest time of year. Christmas and Easter, she was just flat out doing lots of services and really busy doing that. And we were brought up with that. So Christmas had the full kind of Northern Hemisphere tradition, usually snow, the presents, but Christmas had been quite special. It's where we would go to mass, go to church, and had to be very quiet. And then of course, Christmas Day was about presents and eating. And in the UK, watching TV and, you know, watching the Christmas movie. I guess what I saw was then moving to Australia 20 years ago, being really struck by seeing, I can remember my first Christmas in Sydney on Bondi Beach, and someone had trucked in artificial snow. And I just didn't get this. I was like, I thought it would be quite a different Christmas here than what I had grown up with. And this really holding on to the narrative and eating a full Christmas dinner in 30-degree heat. So we did try that one year, and we haven't done that since. So I think this slight incongruence that I experience at this time of year, all my family are in the Northern Hemisphere with COVID, there isn't going to be the opportunity to meet and come together, even for them in the same country. That it's always a wee bit out of sync for me if I'm not with family, because it means family to me. So we create our own, and we have orphans' Christmases, and we do our own thing. But I think it feels like in the absence of ritual, where do we go to for that? So yeah, thanks for sharing and beginning at that point. I think that provides a really nice foundation to now think of, we're hearing already some of the dualities and the contradictions and the tensions that are around as we come to the time of year, and to acknowledge we don't very often have this conversation. So we're going to think about this through the frame of thinking about, is this an adaptive challenge that we're facing in Australia? And I guess by the end of this conversation, hopefully we'll get some insights as to whether it is or not. So I am now going to take this off so I can focus on the work at hand. And to think about, if we're thinking about this as an adaptive challenge, then normally there's some kind of gap between what we espouse and what we are trying to be and who we are and what is currently going on. And that the work of leadership in this is to help us face a new reality. So I want to start from that hypothesis, because it may not be right, but I want to just test that then to understand what is the new reality that we may not be facing that really comes out at this time of year. Aleem, would you like to kick off on that one?
I mean, I think just sort of taking a step back a little bit, I think what happens is that tradition helps people to frame identity and belonging. And so when we question tradition and when we have these conversations, lost conversations, that can feel threatening because it can feel like we're questioning our sense of identity and belonging. But I think more broadly, you know, there's lots of conversations in and around our work, and that I see that Australians broadly are really trying to grapple with who are we? What does it mean to be Australian? And consequently, this new reality is trying to understand that, I think, to some degree. It is, you know, unreconciled past, colonial, relatively recent history. What does it mean to be Australian? You know, high percentage of migrant backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. And so it all sort of comes together to feel quite complex and difficult for people to start to grapple with.
Yeah, I think the sense of that, as you say, Aleem, the traditions help to frame our belonging and identity. And I think, Liz, that is at essence what is going on here, is that the framed traditions and the conventions are not of this land, are not of this place. So part of the new reality is, no, it's, you know, I know I make fun of it, you know, I mean, enough with the frosted windows, you know, I know I make fun of that dynamic, but it's, what it's really showing is that we are imitating either what we remember, or we are making a copy of what we think is the more authentic. And we're neglecting to make it take root here. So that, to me, the reason why this is a big deal in terms of a lost conversation is that the new reality we should be looking for is, how do we adapt what is important to us, take what is important to us, adapt it and move it through so that it can take root here in this place and on this land. And in that regard, it's as, you know, there could be things like, oh, look, these are the Christmas colors because they have to be the Christmas colors because of the tradition that's, you know, thousands of years old. Or we might say that actually there's a tradition that Christianity built on that's even older than that, and it's got to do with the burning of a log. So how do we bring that into the Australian traditions? Actually, well, and people say, no, let's not do log burning at this time of year. That's the risk of bushfire. It is not a good tradition to keep here in Australia. So you can start to see how, what does it mean for us to make the traditions and conventions take root here. But also the other part to me is that Australia is, as a population, is changing its demographic. And we are going to, in the next 30 to 50 years, be more Asian than we are currently. And what that would mean for the population in terms of what we do in late December, early January, will have a different flavor and a different feel. And it is just part of our population demographic evolution. So I think the new reality has got to be twofold. One is make it or help it to take root on this land to this context, but also help to be part of the shifting that's happening in our demographic that is just happening because of migration and population growth.
So before we come to the how do we shift it, it's just if we spend a bit longer just unpacking, you know, what is it that we're currently seeing? So what I'm picking up from both of you, there's a calling to try and understand who we currently are. And, you know, there may be an imitating of other culture, but equally you could argue that sitting underneath that are really strong traditions and sense of belonging and really values and beliefs. So I'm curious about from different lenses that you have, what would you say the different values and beliefs that are playing out at the moment in this conversation? How do they show up?
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of the new reality, just picking up on that, is being able to navigate and embrace multiple or diverse realities. And I think in terms of part of how that's showing up is that there is still very much a dominant narrative, and whether that's, you know, going to a shopping centre and hearing Mariah Carey blasting through the speakers every year for decades, or you know, what Mark was talking to in terms of, you know, you have to put your Christmas tree up at this time and you have to do this and this is how Christmas works, and etc. etc. But increasingly there are other realities and there are other experiences and other ways that people engage with this time of the year. And part of the way that that sort of comes out is that people who traditionally engage with the dominant way of engaging with Christmas can often feel threatened by that. So often there's also this pushback on new and diverse realities because it feels like, well, hang on, if not everyone celebrates Christmas, what does that mean for how I and how we've always celebrated Christmas? And there's that kind of narrative that starts to come through as well.
So I wonder what is it that's being challenged in that with this pushback, Mark? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I just picking up on that notion that there is actually a dominant narrative. There is actually a dominant way, and whether it's at the level of you know, your workplace or social club that has the convention. You know, it's not mandated by law. It's just a kind of social convention. Oh, we're going to have a Christmas party. And straight away, if you're of a different faith, or if Christmas is a trigger for trauma, or if it's, you know, and it's like, so why are we doing this convention? Why do we necessarily? Oh, we just need to celebrate the end of year. And then when someone raises their hand and says, "Can we call it an end of year celebration?" And the reaction that is likely to come to that is, why are you being such a party pooper? What's wrong with wearing these funny hats? It's just a bit of fun. Just get over it. And it's reminiscent of so much of when the dominant cultural ways of doing stuff becomes questioned, the disproportionate reaction to that. It's not, are you questioning? It's like, are you being un-Australian? You know, what, you don't want to play cricket in the backyard? And then you look, how many Australians now have got a backyard big enough for cricket? You know, we're starting to move away from the things that we have held for 2 generations before us, and it will be vastly different in 2 generations' time. And I think the values and beliefs that sit underneath that are calling out for a sense of belonging and identity. Yes, we all have to have prawns. I don't know why, but prawns have become the main thing for an Aussie kind of end of year meal. And so I know that in my house, one of the things we do is we go, let's not try and get prawns for 25th of December, because every time we try, they're already gone. So we try to get prawns on another day. And now that I've said that, all of the people watching and all the people who are going to listen to this later on are going to find out my evil plan or my clever plan, and they will thwart it. The point I'm trying to make here is that we are all trying to find our way at this time of year, navigating through different conventions, different traditions, we may hold a particular way that we try to get through it, but there is a dominant, accepted kind of, yeah, we all do this. And to me, that's the part that is the lost conversation, that Australians are kind of looking to the left and right and going, oh yeah, this is an Aussie Christmas, right? And there's not enough of the questioning to say, well, how do we make more sense of this? Yeah.
So I'm hearing in that, you know, that sitting underneath this may well be that that's an important part of society, that we need to have a sense of belonging, we need to have a sense of identity. So I want to explore that tension a bit more about, so if there is a dominant narrative there around it, and Aleem, you spoke to what happens when that gets challenged or that there's pushback on that. What do you think is at stake here? And why might we not be having the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is speaking very broadly, but often, you know, from the dominant culture's perspective, what feels at stake is that, I guess, diversity can feel like loss. So, because there's this sense that, you know, tradition is being challenged, how people have always, in inverted commas, done things, is being challenged. That, you know, the status quo, I saw someone mention in the chat, is difficult and being challenged. Then everything's being challenged, and you see, you know, the most extreme example of that is people, you know, going onto social media and saying, that's it, they've cancelled Christmas, we're not allowed to say Merry Christmas anymore, it's all over, which is not true, but it can feel like that, and it feels like that because, well, hang on, isn't this the way everyone does this? And now you're telling me it's not. And often we don't, I don't think we do, broadly speaking, nuanced conversations very well, often in our society and in this country. And so it can be difficult initially for people to take a step back and even pose the question, well, do you celebrate Christmas? What does that mean for you? What might that look like in your world? What are you doing? We just make assumptions coming from that dominant position and that narrative that this is the way it's always done. And then the people who are outside of that generally often feel nervous and unsafe to challenge that because of, you know, some of the scenarios that Mark mentioned. Well, I'll just keep my head down, it'll be okay, we'll just get through this, you know, it's just that time of the year, and that happens at many different times of the year. People don't always feel safe to push back on it, and don't necessarily feel safe to share what different things mean to them and how those traditions might be quite different in the way that they celebrate them.
Yeah, the other thing I want to draw out here as well is that even though we're talking about the traditions and the practices and the kind of visible things, the question you asked before about values and beliefs, Liz, I think, you know, we have to name that there is the kind of two cornerstones here in this time of year, and one is the Christianity, and it's, you know, the institutional Christianity, as well as the faith and the personal and community faith of it. But there's Christianity and capitalism. And capitalism, as it reveals itself in the commercialization of it, you know, you need to buy these products, all that sort of. So we've got these two cornerstones happening at this time as well. And they, in themselves, can be very open and liberating and welcoming and accessible, or they could be quite closed. They could be quite closed affairs. And if you are not this persuasion of Christianity, you're not welcome here. Or if you do not have the capital, or you do not have the income or access to funds, then you find yourself unable to do the sorts of things that the imagery is pushing forward. So I think there's a commercial reality of this time of year and the capitalism, but there's also this, this Christian narrative that's there. And the reason why I wanted to name it is I think it's there, and I don't know how many Australians have a close affinity and affection to that, or whether it's just, yeah, it's something about the Jesus, I think, and they, we just, it's baby Jesus story, it's Jesus in a manger story. But we're changing, we're shifting, we're evolving as a society. So what does this mean for us?
So I think you've really touched on there that when we've got an adaptive challenge, we'll see that there's competing commitments. So we've got the religious faith side, and we've got capitalism as well. And then we've got other traditions. And then we've got this sense of identity around what you do if you're Australian at Christmas as well, which are all kind of competing, if you like. And I want to just link to Aleem. You talked about safety around this, about it not being safe to then challenge that. So we're seeing that there's 4 maybe competing values, potentially more. But can you just talk a bit about the safety aspect and why it doesn't feel safe, and what you mean by safety in relation to this conversation? A few things in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think social media amplifies this and makes it difficult often to have, I guess, safe conversations. We're quite good at being very black and white. With relative, those platforms lend themselves well to kind of yelling at each other or cutting across each other. They don't necessarily lend themselves well to forums like this, where you kind of grapple with challenging questions. And when I think, various minorities in our communities and societies look at the dominant narrative and look at what the media says and look at what leaders say and politicians say, they draw their sense of safety from, is there a diversity of conversation? What happens and look at what happens when someone does try and challenge the dominant narrative, and how that often doesn't go well. And so I think, the broad observation is that, well, if that's what happens broadly, then how can I feel safe to do that? Obviously, in a more localized context and in a neighbor context and in specific community contexts, the safety can come from relationship, from people engaging, with their neighbors and humanizing the conversation and being genuine about building relationship and understanding each other and recognizing that, not everyone is the same, not everyone practices the same things, and that increasingly in a society where we are increasingly secular, where close to 30% of people identified no religion in the last census, that things are shifting. And I do wonder whether, traditions like Christmas are less about religion and or spirituality, but more about people trying to find meaning. If we don't have Christmas or we don't celebrate Christmas this way, then what does that mean? What does that mean for who we are? I think that's part of the challenge as well.
So I wonder if that is, and we can look into this in the way through, but whether that is a universal search for meaning as well, that doesn't belong to particular cultures or traditions, that we're all trying to make sense of, what it means to be in Australia. So, but at Christmas, we hold on really tightly to what is known. If I speak for myself and what I see playing out, that, even my own family, I can remember when there was an alternative proposition put forward about how we spent Christmas, and it caused, massive ruptions that we could even have that conversation. So if we think about that in a small system, to then think about really challenging the sacred cow of Christmas and how it should look and feel. I guess I'm curious then around this bit about what's the underlying loss at stake here. You talked about loss earlier, but what is it that we stand to lose that means that we are holding on really tightly to this tension between a Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, capitalism, Christianity, and other faiths that we have this. What is it that we fear we're going to lose?
Well, I think that I used the framing around 2 generations ago, that most people were doing similar things at this time of year. And you had neighborhoods where you looked up and down the street and there were a lot of people doing very similar things to you. And that felt affirming. That felt like we were connected. That felt like even though there might be different accents, or maybe they've got different spices in what they're doing at lunch, but everyone was doing very similar things. And also notably, 2 generations ago, we didn't have this 24-hour late night shopping, like frenzy kind of feel as well. Like the shopping was done, people were back, and it was very much like home focused, neighborhood focused, that kind of feel. Sorry, and I just want to acknowledge that there's always this thread that that's not everyone's reality. Even 2 generations ago, there were still people missing out on that dynamic. But that kind of predictable, everyone around me is doing similar things, from a systems point of view, gives a great sense of affirmation that I'm okay, that my identity, my sense of belonging, the way I express who I am is okay, it's acceptable. Because up and down the street, and most people around are doing these sorts of things. We go to the park, we sing carols. Incidentally, you notice that Christmas is also the time of year where most people can get through verses 1 and 2 in the songs, because they're just so ingrained and we just can feel them. And we're like, oh yeah, I can sing this one, I can sing this one. And anyway, I digress. The point of that is that we've got these sorts of conventions and traditions that happened 2 generations ago, felt very secure. And when you correlate that to so much else that happened 2 generations ago, there's a lot of security in what we thought was the images of Aussie identity, what we thought was the actions of what is an honourable Aussie male and honourable Aussie female. It was more clear cut, more understood from a dominant culture point of view. And now 2 generations to here, so much of that is in flux, and so much of the ways we express and so much of the ways that we demonstrate who we are. When we look at things like, and I know this is creeping into our next third conversation, but if you look at the anthem that was sung recently at the Wallabies game, that, it raised a whole sorts of questions. How can we sing a song? How do we share our national culture together now that this diversity? And Aleem, I really like that comment about how the diversity can feel like loss for the dominant culture. And the point that I'm trying to make is that when you see yourself reflected in dominant culture, you feel like you belong. But if you have grown up in Australia seeing dominant culture and not seeing yourself, feeling like that is not a reflection of you, that's not a reflection of your cultural background or your orientation or your faith or your belief, your spirituality, the way you think we ought to use our natural resources is not being reflected in dominant culture, then you feel like, I need to do something about that, or I need to promote an alternative or make a change. And I think, Liz, that in the same way that you experienced with your family's tradition, hey, can we do an alternative? And it was met with, oh, are you crazy? I think that dynamic is writ large for Australia, but this is our opportunity. Can we have an alternative way to celebrate the end of the calendar year and moving into the new year in a way that brings more of us saying, that feels like me, that feels like who I am, that reflects my sense of identity and belonging as an Australian.
I mean, I think, sorry, just quickly, I mean, I think there's something quite simple and beautiful about coming together, even if it is local community Christmas carols. There's something quite beautiful about coming together as community to celebrate something. And I think that, more than coming out for Christmas carols, that's broadly why people do that, is because, let's do something as part of a collective. Let's, maybe subconsciously just push back for a minute on the capitalism that you mentioned, and let's just do something as community. But I think what we stand to lose by just having this very narrow, dominant narrative is we stand to lose cultural richness, and we stand to lose kind of, I don't think we have this ability, but we stand to lose the possibility of gaining maturity as people and communities to be able to not just celebrate something, but to grieve something as well. It feels like, I think my experience of Australian culture broadly is we're very one-tracked. This is how you do this. We can't have a nuanced conversation around it. So, you know, and this will obviously come up in the third conversation, but this is how you sing the national anthem, and we can't have a nuanced conversation about it. This is how we do that, and we can't have a nuance. We stand to lose being able to have difficult conversations that bring that richness to what is going on around us.
Mm. So I wonder, Aleem, what you've tapped into there is what happens when the dominant culture gets challenged, because I'm also reminded of outside of Australia, in the UK, recently there was an ad for one of the large supermarket chains, Sainsbury's, which had a kind of typical Christmas of a family cooking dinner together, sitting down to eat, opening presents, you know, trying to get everybody back in the one place. And the difference from that and previous ads is that the family were Black, and there was an outrage in the country because it very deeply polarized. Most people went, of course, this is a no-brainer. This reflects the reality of the country that we are. But there was a minority of people with very loud voices who felt that it really had gone to challenge some of the core idea of what it means to have Christmas. And I think this is where I wonder, I'm just making the link with what you said, Mark, about, if I think about my own family Christmases, when that dominant narrative is challenged, it challenges where power traditionally sits. So if I bring it back to my family context, changing that meant that, you know, my mum didn't have the role that she would normally have, that she needed to share that role and give that up, which is why when she really wanted to do that so that she had more help, but when actually it became a reality, something was deeply threatened about a sense of place and a role, but also that we get power from some of the traditional roles that we're in. And, you know, I wonder if this conversation goes to the root of that we're calling for to make this change. We've actually got to, speaking as a white Australian, let go of power, let go of some of that traditional way of doing things that has been seen as being the right way for something else that is actually much more inclusive and equitable. And I think in that, I can say that as someone who has some power and I have a voice. I think for many people who don't feel like they have power and a voice, to even go into that conversation feels deeply, deeply challenging. And yet it denies the reality of the country that we're in. So, I think that what you're touching on here really gets to the core, actually, you know, the power part, the role, but also what happens when our values get challenged.
Yeah, and this is why, for me, it is such an important dimension of the lost conversations. I mean, it's not a likely suspect. You know, when you're thinking about, there are so many other First Nations issues that we need to grapple with. Let's focus on them. Let's get to the nitty-gritty of formal arrangements or some of the social determinants of health, etc. And yet, what's happening here is it's so pervasive right across society that there are these things that we ought to do. There is a right way of doing it. There's no puppet master. There's no chief architect or organizer or orchestrator of all of these conventions, but we have inherited them and we are perpetuating them. And yet we haven't asked ourselves, so what is the meaning of them? And how are we perpetuating meaning in a way that makes sense to us as Australians? And to me, that feels like a necessary conversation for us to be able to address some of these harder and tougher issues, because they will come up there as well. So the kind of pervasive bit of pizzazz and tinsel and high visual impact of this time of year is actually demonstrating some of the stuff that we need to do in the serious, tough, down in the coalface, frontline kind of work. There are values that are different. There's a deep sense of understanding about history that is different. There is probably a deep feeling about identity and belonging that is different. And how do we navigate that and talk about that? And if we can't ask questions about, I don't know, tinsels and cards without getting laws, you're being un-Australian. If you don't like it, then you don't celebrate it. And, you know, okay, so we actually now can't have a conversation about youth suicide for First Nations and other young Australians, because we still can't even have a more a conversation about things that are kind of more garish and loud in front of us.
So this seems like we're naturally going into them thinking about, as an adaptive challenge, we've got our current reality, which has competing commitments with capitalism, Christianity, a Southern Hemisphere reality, and a Northern Hemisphere narrative. And we have one of the most multicultural countries in the Southern Hemisphere. And we're struggling to have that conversations then between this is our current reality and this is what we espouse we are. So I wonder if we now go into, so what's the gap in the middle? That there's a gap between what we're doing and what we espouse that we are. What would that take if we were to try and bridge that gap and to try and actually step into being an equitable, inclusive, multicultural country that really embraced that? So I'm curious about, you know, what are some of the conditions that might need to shift?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, part of the gap is leadership, I think. I think there's a bit of, again, broadly speaking, a bit of a vacuum when it comes to principled leadership, particularly, you know, in the major institutions that Australians have historically, you know, respected in terms of government and public service and things like that. And so there doesn't seem to be, in terms of that leadership, a clear vision to move us forward. It feels like there's nothing necessarily calling us forward or calling us to aspire to something. And I think in that absence, people then just hold on to what they know and what feels safe. And so that further entrenches, in some respects, the dominant narrative, because it's like, well, no one's calling us necessarily to be better or think differently or whatever. And so we'll just hold on to what we know.
Where should that vision come from? I'm curious, you're saying leadership. I'm wondering where you're expecting to see that and where that vision should come from.
I mean, broadly, there's obviously multiple tiers of government, and I think, you know, it to some degree it comes from other institutions, not just government, but equally, you know, major institutions in this country are sort of going through their own processes of, you know, addressing colonization, or, you know, the term of decolonization, looking at how they've operated, the traditions that formed them as well. And so I think there is this kind of broad sense of a lot of movement in institutions. And then I guess when it, you know, comes to government, we tend to work mostly with local government, partly because they're quite place-based, they understand the complexity and the nuance of their communities. But increasingly we're seeing that leadership happen at a local level, where local councils really are being willing to have these conversations, are willing to bring diverse groups of community stakeholders together, are willing to really interrogate their own internal practices and look at how that has historically impacted their communities and their planning for those communities. So I think it is very much happening at a grassroots level. We're not necessarily seeing it at a broader level.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think for what it would take is that we have to address power. We have to address power and permission and the opportunity to look for new ways to share power. And as soon as I say share power, I know that it can freak some people out, but also rally some other people to say, yeah, let's go and storm the castle, as it were. But to me, the simplicity of this in sharing power or having the power conversation spoken about is that you can have a stage where it's like, okay, I'll share power of how to do this thing, like how to do this traditions. Here's what we do. So you do this like me. And so in some ways, we may be caught in that dynamic where it's like, okay, so we do this. Yes, you go and do this and you do this and do that and do that. Now you're doing just like me. Well done. I have shared an element of power through the knowledge of this is how you do this tradition. And now you're doing it like me. But then we can get to the next stage, which would be like, how do we do this together? So I may actually find I do this tradition in a way that kind of brings, Aleem, you talked about the nuanced conversations before. There's a peculiarity or a particularity that I might do this tradition that's not the same as you, but so we're doing it together because you've taught me, and but we're sharing power. We're doing the same thing, but we might have different ways. So there's a power shift from either me copying and imitating to me now saying, I am doing this like you together, but I've just got a mark way of flavor and idiosyncratic kind of peculiar way of doing it. But it's the tradition we're doing together. But the third stage would be when we find ways to do this together. And that would mean that whoever taught me this stuff, whoever said, come and do this like me and back in stage one, that they would have to then really shift their power to say, I'm prepared to find a new way together. And that allows me to bring up and exercise to say, I want to find a new way together. It's a little bit me, it's a little bit you, but it's actually another way. And I think that final stage is where Australia ought to get to. It's certainly, although I haven't done a lot of the research on it, what I've seen in the United States over the last 150 years, that's what they did. They said, we need to take a little bit of what we've inherited, but we also need to make this very much North American way. So this is how we will do this stuff together. And we've not done that yet in Australia, but this is our opportunity to get to that third part.
So just to, I'm just thinking many people listening to this or watching this might be going, yeah, this all sounds great. But, in fact, it sounds a bit like a Christmas carol, that everything, if we just do these things, it's all going to be wonderful. And I can hear Mariah Carey in the background as the theme tune. But I'm wondering if, what we're talking about here and what you both mentioned is we're challenging really deeply entrenched power structures or ways of doing things in tradition that many people may not even be seeing any of this as a problem or a challenge, or not even knowing what is it that we're talking about here. And whilst we can have that change, and I just want to link in a question that's come in, that we can have that change at a grassroots level, but unless it's really embedded in the structures and that structural racism, structural inequality is challenged, we're not going to really see any shifts. So there's a question here about how do we get real about what it's going to take to really bring about and accelerate change? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think what we have seen this year, in a way, has been a bit of a demonstration of the kinds of things that it would take to make a shift, to make a change, to adjust our expected ways of doing things, to have to do things in new and radically different ways. So we've had to adjust deeply sacred ceremony of funeral, laying people to rest, we have had to do that differently this year. We have had to actually make a shift, a change on one of our universally sacred moments in that transition of life. And we did that because we had to, not just because our state government or whatever local municipality was saying, oh, look, these are the COVID-19 rules. But we did that because we understood the why. We understood the purpose of making that kind of change. And for me, that is part of what's required for us to keep an element of traditions and ceremonies need to make sense to this land, to us as a people, who we are. And we may need to make radical shifts from what we did imagine previously to what we're going to imagine going forward. But there's also another thing that was demonstrated this year, and that's the capacity for big institutions to make big decisions really quickly. You know, we've always said, oh, state governments or federal governments, they take ages to do stuff, ages to do things. And then in a pandemic like this, we have seen the nimble nature of power structures, decision-making bodies to say, we will adjust, we will redirect resources, we will reorganize priorities. And it's not just government systems, but it's business systems and it's community organization systems. We will reorganize and reset our expectations.
Mm.
So I think that the challenge that has come through in the question is true, that we can have a sense of capability at a local level where we've got more power to exercise our authority. But we have seen this year that it is possible for those various stages or levels of government and to make those shifts as well.
Mm. And Aleem, you spoke about seeing this shift happening at a local government level. I'm curious about the conditions that have been in place when you've seen the lost conversations being able to be had and people really interrogate their own part of it. What have been the conditions that's enabled that to happen?
Yeah, it's been a few different things, and I think, you know, that's a really good question that was posted on Q&A. Partly, it's been an identified need in some form really has triggered that. So for 45% of local government areas in this country, they're grappling even, you know, pre-COVID, but certainly has continued through COVID. They're grappling with population and economic decline. You know, so for a while, the dominant narrative has been, you know, there's been this sort of extreme narrative that Australia's full, that there's no room, that we're being flooded. 45% of local government areas are desperate for people. So their need is, how do we attract people to our communities? How do we get them to stay in our communities? And they recognize that the way that they need to do that is through the shifting diversity of their communities. So whilst we're, you know, broadly a multicultural nation, they're often communities that have lower levels of diversity. They don't necessarily have lived experience with diverse communities. And so they want to learn how to do that better because they recognize that it's actually in their best interests. They actually have to do this. Otherwise, their communities, their economy, their region is literally dying because the population is aging and it's not being replaced. Alternatively, the other 55% rapid urbanisation and growth, how do we do this better? How do we get on better? How do we maintain and advance social cohesion? How do we you know, understand each other and this rapidly growing diversity that's going on in our communities? And then, you know, the other thing which Mark touched on so beautifully is this sense increasingly that we don't have a choice. You know, whether it's the COVID crisis or the bushfire crisis or climate change or other things that are going on, the need to change is almost being taken out of our hands. And so if we don't sort of move with that, and if we don't try and respond better and be, I guess, a bit more on the front foot in this work, then the repercussions or the sense of that is potentially quite catastrophic. And so, you know, there's the sense too that there's an opportunity out of a crisis. And so we're chatting with local communities about, you know, the amazing things that they've managed to achieve and do differently in this 12 months, and how can that inform the next period of time so they don't go back to that kind of sense of business as usual.
Mm. So something that you both touched on is that, if you like, the need to maintain the heat that has been generated from disruption that we've had over the last year from COVID, Black Lives Matter, but also that, I guess, that kind of growing consciousness that has started to emerge, that it did spread here in Australia, and that people are now questioning things that they weren't aware of previously. And so I'm curious about, particularly talking about something like Christmas and the end of the year, about if this is an opportunity to help address this broader adaptive challenge we're facing, how do we get the balance between both maintaining a bit of heat on this issue and also starting to kind of, but also acknowledging the deeply held values, beliefs, and the sense of loss that there is in this challenge? And I'm curious about, you know, what your thoughts are on that, about how to balance that out, but also where could that heat come from?
Well, I think the first thing we should probably also acknowledge is that not only was there lots of energy around particular movements throughout the year, but there's also a lot of fatigue. We get to this time of year, we're like, wow, we made it this far. You know, and it's like all our adaptation and all that nimbleness that I was saying that, you know, big institutions were able to do. I'm sure that there are people going in those systems going, we can't sustain this. We can't keep maneuvering like this. I know that in local communities, people are fatigued by the level of adaptation. So there is heat that needs to be kept on the kind of social inequity that has been revealed this year. It was already an existing vibrant conversation that was had by people in, I don't know, social services or justice movements, or people who were already concerned about racial equity or you know, economic inequity. They were already, all conversations were already live. The reality of people going into lockdown, shutdown, slowdown throughout this year really revealed that to a lot more of the population. They were like, wow, I am doing my lockdown with so many resources, but there are people doing lockdown who have, you know, a lot less than me. And the link I make to that is, like you said, Aleem, there was an identified need. You see that with your organization, that there are local governments who are identifying a need, not only to attract population, but what do we do with social cohesion, because we have lots of people moving in. And I think part of what we need to be exploring now is how this already existing conversation about social equity, cohesion, a better way forward, a more just way forward, is now being seen by a lot more people, to provide heat for that and momentum for that without fatiguing everyone. You know, there's a marathon sense to that move, but we probably need to put in a few sprints here and there to get people to pay attention. But this element of social change and is always around us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think my hope out of 2020, and hopefully if COVID's teaching us anything, is a willingness to be able to talk about what's important, you know, and what's important is people's well-being. What's important is, and, you know, even through the lens of Christmas is, you know, what's important is coming together as we increasingly can. You know, we couldn't celebrate anything really at certain parts of this year very well. You know, coming together in the same room and sharing a meal and, you know, talking about how, you know, hopefully most of us have made it, and what that might mean for our years ahead, and that time to rest and reflect and refresh. So, you know, bringing in the conversation a little bit to just be less caught up in, you know, necessarily tradition and the structure of what we think is important, but actually talking about, you know, what's really important, and having some kind of open human conversation.
Mm. So I just want to pull a few threads together that you've raised so far, is that to be able to bridge this gap, there needs to be, if you like, enough of a shared vision or purpose about what's the country we want to become, an opportunity to have that dialogue. And that to do that, we've got to both acknowledge the current condition, to look at, well, where is the readiness, if you like, to have this type of conversation? Where are people starting to do that? And Aleem, you've talked about where that's happening at a local level, but I think part of the work is also looking for who else and where else is this conversation taking place, and what is it that people in authority, what signals are we getting from people in authority about a willingness and readiness to engage in this? Where is there some shift, maybe in the messaging or the framing about challenges, that we can seize an opportunity to see that actually we might be aligned on some of this issue, not all of it, but there might be some alignment somewhere. And the importance of also having time to celebrate and come together, that we've got to be able to, you know, if we want to stay in the game, we've got to be able to come together and ground ourselves in that. But the other thing that comes to mind for me is, you know, we know that in adaptive work, you've got to have some kind of container to have this dialogue and the hard conversations. And Aleem, you talked before about the issue of safety, that when people do challenge the dominant culture, there's pushback, and that often the container for that can be having lots of allies and the networks and the collaborations already in place who can be building on the arguments, so that when someone does step out, the ice metaphorically doesn't crack behind them, but that there are other people who are also taking up that voice and sharing that from a range of different institutions. And I guess that has been the shift that I've seen over the last year, that unlikely suspects and people starting to talk about racial equity, about, you know, the increasing gap in around inequality, that who previously would never have been bringing this forward. So I wonder if there's also, as we're looking to what does this take, opportunities for all of us to think about who are the unlikely suspects, who are the people we could partner with, who do have a stake in this and care about it. And it might be that they have a different view, but we actually do want the same thing at the end of the day, which is this sense of belonging, to have a kind of way of feeling like the traditions that we have here matter and they're real and that we can talk about them. So I'm curious about, if we got kind of really granular now, what would this look like for people listening to this and people involved in this conversation about, you know, what can you and I, what can we go away and think about and do beyond have a good break, go to the beach, have a good rest, enjoy time with the people we love. What could that look like if we were to try and nudge this forward from our own position and our own power that we have?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. The nudging forward for me is around our own consciousness of the stuff that we do. Our ability to be aware of, I do this for a reason, or I do this because it's kind of what my family taught me to do, or it's what my friends, we do this, you know, a bunch of us, we get together, we do this. Even having that level of awareness already brings a greater capability for cross-cultural communication, because cross-cultural dialogue is when, oh, why do you do that? That thing you're eating there, where does that come from? Oh, why do you wear that? Or what's going on there? And if Australians were much more aware of how they were doing their own stuff, they would be more capable of being able to have that cross-cultural dialogue. And that in itself means a better and already a platform for deeper conversation or deeper collaboration, because we're having people who are not just saying, oh, I've got no culture, but I'll tell you what I do at this time of year. And they will run through a whole list of conventions that they do, a whole heap of family traditions, friends traditions, and they may even do some sacred ceremony at this time. And when you're coming from a First Nations point of view, I can see that and go, why can't we have that dialogue in that regard? So that's one thing for me, it's just that open awareness. But I think the second thing is the curiosity to say, well, what could this look like for us to do this? Yes, we have prawns. Yes, we have Barbies. Yes, the watermelon has all the Christmas colors, red, green, and white. Maybe that's our symbol here in Australia. I don't know. But if more and more of us are going, let's keep knocking on the door and asking the questions around what this might look like here and how we can make it more appropriate here, that lends itself to the environment that says, let's make some stuff together. Let's do this together. Let's draw on the cultural richness that we have on this land to make some stuff together. And the final thing for me is also then just being comfortable and being aware that we don't need to copy others. And if there's one thing that Australians have demonstrated in the last, ever since Europeans have been here, is that we can be fiercely, oh, we're not like them, we're not like them, we're not like them. And I would really want to call that notion up, that quality of Australian nature, to say, how can we be distinctive? And really distinctive to say, we're not going to imitate. We are actually going to innovate and make something here that is genuinely us. Those types of conversations help us with all of the dialogue that we have on national identity going forward, not just at this Christmas time.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I mean, there's this kind of phrase and term that gets thrown around a lot, sort of in the space that we work in, but also at political levels around Australian values. I think that what we know from observation and experience is that Australian values are really human values. And I think the way to understand that better is what Mark's talking about, which is about being willing to pose the question rather than make a statement. And when we are willing to ask questions like of other people, like what traditions are important to you? Why are they important to you? What is it about them? How do you celebrate them? We can begin to understand that really there's a lot of common threads, and it's okay to celebrate Christmas in the way that you wish. It's also okay to celebrate other things, and that people often have really quite common values across all those things, and being willing to pose all those questions. I think also it's important to not just talk about the need for change, but also highlight other ways of doing things and alternatives, and showcasing alternative practice. And the example that I can immediately think of, which isn't Christmas related and more speaks to what your next conversation will be, but is there's a council who's decided to cancel their Australia Day fireworks and invest that money in truth telling and working with traditional owners and local elders to bring together diverse communities to have quite a deep and a rich conversation on the morning of the 26th of January. It's got a variety of responses, but increasingly, regardless of what the example is, being able to hold these examples up and talk about them and having a conversation about them helps us to, I guess, begin to address some of that vision piece of, well, if we don't do it this way, do we do it that way, or do we do it another way? But can we at least talk about the different ways of doing things?
And what both of you seem to be talking to is really a lot of the work in deep collaboration, which is about how do we, if we're going to innovate, and not imitate, Mark, to use your language. We need to be able to have difference. We need to have different ideas. We need to be able to hold the conflict of that. We need to actually be able to work that through with purpose and role, and not avoid and work around that conflict, which is generally what we can get stuck in. We get stuck in that politeness, particularly when it comes to talking about culture and race and power. And I think what you've also spoken to, and Aleem, you mentioned this, is around the ability to be able to, lead with questions and lead with curiosity rather than jump straight into problem solving when we actually don't deeply understand what the problem is. And depending on where you sit in the community, you're going to view the problem in a slightly different way. So they need to kind of bring that together and then be able to demonstrate that these things have worked. And in that way, we can movement build, because we can look to where have other people done this and look, it wasn't that scary. We were able to have that conversation, and what did we learn from it? So I think there's some great tangible things that you're bringing forward, which speak to the heart of the work of deep collaboration and what it is that we're trying to do there to help us ease into these conversations. So just before we end, I'm just interested in what you would like to kind of leave. If there's one thing people can do differently. And then I'd love to hear from people in the chat who are on the webinar today about what have you heard and what's one thing that you are going to go away and think about, an insight that you're going to go and do differently or think about, or something that's challenged you or struck you. Please, would love to hear that in the chat. And while you're doing that though, Aleem, Mark, what's the kind of leadership work? What's the one thing you would ask people to go away and reflect on or do?
Well, I know I've talked a lot about the shifting and changing and alterations, modifications. However, there is part of doing the work of deep collaboration, doing the work of having these tough dialogues where you have to really know what it is that that's really precious to you, that's really important to you. It's the core of the thing that you will defend, that you will say, this is so important, I want this to be carried through to the new reality. I really want us to not lose this or not forget this. And I really want to encourage people on the call today, the people watching this recording, that we will be able to identify what we cherish the most at this time and take that as a way to say, as we move to the new reality for the next 2 generations to come, here's a precious thing around this time of year that I want to pass on, that I want to make others remember. And yeah, we'll do the innovation and all the fancy bits around that, but here's the core part that I want to pass on to do that. I want to encourage people to do that.
Thanks, Mark. Aleem?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and probably quite similar to Mark. I think for me, and I will do this as well as I eventually take a break at the end of this year, is I think we need to start with ourselves and take time for a bit of self-reflection and pause if we're able to do that, and really consider what is important to me, what matters about this time of the year or not, but then also find people close to you in your life or not, or people that you feel, I guess, safe to do this with, and offer them the opportunity to do that as well, and engage on that level, and be willing to have that open discussion around, what's important to you. Why do you think we do this? Does that matter to you? And maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but I think, I'm always surprised at what comes out of those conversations. And if people can come to those conversations with a level of humility and generosity, it's quite amazing, the willingness that can come from people to reconsider the status quo.
So I'm hearing a great invitation there to seize a leadership moment, if you like, which is to question, to challenge, why do we do this? And or open that up to people to have the dialogue and the conversation. So I want to just end by just seeing if there's, just to hold a bit of space for any questions that people may have, or any insights that people want to feed back of what stood out for them from today. What's one thing you're going to do and take away as you leave? Just hold a minute for that. Maybe we can have the other, the potential, what the new vision could look like, Michelle, in terms of an alternative to Mariah Carey as we come to this time of year. So thanks, everybody. If there's no more questions coming through, just remains for us to thank you for joining us in this conversation. Look forward to joining you in the new year, but to encourage you to have these conversations where you can. And really, thanks, Aleem, for bringing in your perspective, your wisdom and your thoughts today and joining us in the conversation. Thanks also to you, Mark.
Thank you.
I'll just hand over to you to close.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks for watching. And I hope to have you join us for the next conversation on the 19th of January, where we seek to have a robust and open dialogue, but also challenging conversation around what does a national day look like for us. If you thought that Christmas was a tough conversation to have, wait till you get to the January one. So we're looking forward to you joining us then, and stay safe and have a great break over this hot summer holiday. Thank you.
All the best.